Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to see you all here. Welcome to Hadar's fall series, our Elul series entitled Core Issues in Jewish Prayer. My name is Elie Kaunfer. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks, including a roadmap for these three lectures, and then we're going to dive into the issue at hand tonight, which is really a discussion of the words of prayer. I want to start by welcoming our full-time fellows who started their day today here at Yeshivat Hadar. These are people who are with us for the next 9 months doing learning and davening and community outreach, and we're so excited to have you all here. So thank you. And I also want to welcome the alums of our program, both our full-time programs and our executive seminar. It's good to see you all back, and welcome all the new faces in the room. Okay, I'm going to start by putting my cards on the table and speak a little bit about why I think it's important to talk about prayer. Prayer is a core part, if not the core part, of what it means to be a religious person. It's the expression of what it means to be a Jew standing in covenantal relationship with God, and it's nothing short of Judaism's answer to connecting with the divine. Or, in the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, a teacher that I'm going to quote repeatedly tonight and next week, to live without prayer is to live without God, to live without a soul. Prayer, when taken seriously, is miraculous. And I want to point to a couple of miraculous features of prayer. It has the power to elevate us. It has the power to put God at the center of our experience and to refocus our connection away from worldly things towards the divine, hopefully impacting our experience in the world itself. It also has a miraculous potential for intensity. The Baal Shem Tov said famously, "Zeu chesed gadol me'Hashem yitbarach she'adam chai achar hatfilah." It's a great chesed from God. It's a great gift from God that people survive the hour of prayer. When you take that seriously, you can see the true miraculous power of what prayer could offer. And yet, we're so often far from that experience. Instead, we're living in a period that's animated by a crisis of prayer, to use another term of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And this can be attributed to many factors. It could be related to a lack of prayer role models. It could be related to a deficit of inspiration, to an inability to focus. But if I was going to pick one, I would say it's the following: cynicism. Cynicism is really the ultimate roadblock, in my opinion, that prevents us from experiencing that miraculous moment or prayer life. The cynic in us, the cynic in me, always maligns the possibility of prayer. We talk, we joke, we read, we cross our legs, we fold our arms. We don't really believe that there's any deep power in prayer. And so we mock the people who think that there's a possibility of prayer, even if those people aren't even alive anymore. The goal of this series is to say the forces of cynicism don't always have to win. If we meet head-on the difficulties in davening, then we are at least taking seriously the potential in what it means to pray. And it's my intention to examine these difficulties head-on, together with you, to open up new pathways in prayer. Before I move further to laying out the structure of this series, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge some of my teachers in some of this thinking. I've learned a tremendous amount about what it means to pray and what it means to study the text of prayer from a number of teachers, including Rabbi Eben Leader, Dr. Devorah Steinmetz, and my own parents, Rabbi Alvin and Marcia Kaunfer. I also want to take a moment to credit my colleagues who are my fellow travelers in what it means to study and live a prayerful life, both the leaders of Machon Hadar, Ethan Tucker, Shai Held, Avital Hochstein, and to all those people in the extended Hadar community, stretching back 10 years ago to Keilat Hadar's founding, who really opened up for me the possibility of what it means to pray fully without having to check a part of myself at the door. This series is divided into 3 parts. Tonight we're going to focus on the words of prayer and explore a particular approach to interpretation. Next week, we'll move beyond the words, turning our attention to the aesthetics of prayer. And finally, in the 3rd session, led by my colleague Joey Weisenberg, we're going to explore the connection to music and the possibilities unlocked through singing in prayer. But tonight I want to focus on the issue of the text of prayer and ultimately describe a methodology of interpreting prayers that is in service of increasing the religion quotient in the analysis of texts of prayers. That is to say, there are many ways of considering the texts of prayers. But for my purposes, unless they lead to a religious end, they're of little use in solving the crisis of prayer. In the academic study of liturgy, there have been three major approaches to encountering the texts of prayer. I'm going to briefly describe them here, and then I'm going to contrast these approaches with the one that I'm suggesting here tonight, which I will term the literary intertext approach. Then we'll put this methodology, the literary intertext methodology, to the test. First, with a fairly uncontroversial line from Havdalah, and perhaps, if time allows, a line from the Amida. So on to the academic models. One of the first modern scholars of the scientific study of Judaism, Leopold Zunz, pioneered one approach to dealing with words, and specifically words in prayers. Zunz's approach, known as philology, is reflective of the academic spirit of his age in the 1800s. By studying the variants and history of the text, he claimed to be able to uncover the earliest recension of the prayer. Zunz and his intellectual heirs, including scholarly giants such as Ismar Elbogen, Daniel Goldschmidt, Ezra Fleischer, and the contemporary scholar Uri Ehrlich, believe that such an original text can be uncovered. You can find the first text of the Amida, let's say, or any particular blessing. And many in the school also try to connect some political explanation to tie to the original text. If we could derive the original text, then let's think about what the political motivations for why someone might have written that text were. And the most famous of this example is the curse against the heretics, the blessing of the heretics in the Amida, which people have tried to connect to actual political events on the ground some 2,000 years ago. Joseph Heinemann represents the teacher of the second approach in academic study of liturgy, known as form criticism. And here he takes a page out of the extent of biblical textual approach by saying that basically there is no such thing as an ur-text. There is no original text. Texts arose at the same time in tandem. There's no way of identifying what the number one original text was. Even if there was such a text, we couldn't identify it. But his theory basically is that these were multiple expressions of the same idea that happened together. And there was no rabbinic central authority that had control over saying this is the text, which then got edited later. So instead of having one text that splits, it was many texts that perhaps got funneled into one. What does Heinemann do then if we can't find an original text? He tries to classify texts not by their age, but by their institutional origin. So he takes something like Baruch Hu, and he says, oh, I noticed something about Baruch Hu. It's one of the few texts of prayers that's in the second person, right? Baruch Hu means you bless. It's a command. You should bless. So who's speaking to me? Who's speaking to the worshiper? And Heinemann identifies that with the priestly institutional locus, where priests were telling other Jews how to worship, or to worship in this moment. That's contrasted with something that comes out of, let's say, a Beit Midrash origin, the study hall origin, where he connects something like the Kaddish. Okay, so for Heinemann, it wasn't the idea of finding the original form of the Kaddish, but to say that the Kaddish and Baruch Hu are totally different because they arise out of different institutional origins. The final academic approach I'm just going to briefly touch on is one pioneered by Larry Hoffman in his book entitled Beyond the Text, which was published back in 1988. Hoffman is a scholar at Hebrew Union College, and if you're interested in those previous two approaches, the philology approach and the form criticism approach, he also writes about those in his book. But Hoffman basically recognizes that praying is much more than texts, and as a result, he introduces what he calls the holistic approach. In his words, this approach is meant to argue from texts to people. Hoffman isn't interested in the text ultimately. He's interested in what the text can tell me about the people who were saying the texts. And in service of that goal, he employs a holistic approach, that is to say, a multidisciplinary approach, drawing on the ideas of anthropology and linguistic theory to say something significant about the people who were saying the texts. Now, Hoffman is surely right when he states, prayers are unique human cultural extensions of those who pray them, indistinguishable as prayers, in fact, as long as they are separated from the act of praying. Hoffman stresses his holistic approach when he says, liturgy is not a literary matter in the first place. Okay, that's a fairly bold claim. In other words, as the title of his book suggests, I'm moving beyond the text. I don't care about the text as an end in itself. I care about the people who said it. But while there's much appealing in Hoffman's approach, tonight I'm not really prepared to move fully beyond the text, because it's really the word or the wordiness of prayers that, for the cynics among us, either provides an opportunity for blockage or, in a best case scenario, a way in. That is to say, what ultimately connects me to praying? It's the words. And I want to offer an interpretive approach that hopefully can connect us to those words in a deeper way, and that's what I'm calling the literary intertext approach. Now, in the academic world, the inspiration for this approach is Reuven Kimmelman, who's a professor at Brandeis. He really takes prayers and he looks at the literary themes within the prayers, and he connects them to the texts that stand behind the prayers. And for those of you who have the source sheet, I'm on source number 3 here. Kimmelman writes, the meaning of the liturgy exists not so much in the liturgical text per se, as in the interaction between the liturgical text and the biblical intertext. Meaning, in the mind of the reader, takes place between texts rather than within them. Now, what Kimmelman is saying in plain English is you can never examine a text on its own. You have to always look at the other text, the intertext, that stands behind the text of the prayer book, and by juxtaposing them, that's how you create meaning. Now, while Kimmelman represents the modern representative of this approach, the idea is quite old, and I want to look at 2 stages of development going backwards. The first would be the medieval stage, and I'll identify the Rabbi Bar Yakar, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yakar, who was the teacher of the Ramban, and Abu Draham. These were 2 medieval commentators, the prior one living in the 13th century, Abu Draham in the 14th century. And they constructed book-length commentaries on the Siddur, essentially dedicated to finding the biblical intertext of prayer. And I brought you here in source 4 the language of Abu Draham. I'll read it in the English. You should know, he writes at the beginning of his commentary, that the language of prayer is based on the language of Scripture. Therefore, you will find written in this commentary on every word a verse relating to its essence. There are a few words that did not have a biblical basis, and therefore I will bring for them a basis from the Talmud. But again, Abu Draham's whole project here is to say there is a text that's in dialogue with the text of the Siddur. Now, Abu Draham drew on the work of the Rabbi Bar Yakar, who was less known, but he actually copied whole swaths of his book. The good old days of where plagiarism was a compliment. But the methodology even extends earlier than the medieval period. And that's something that's illustrated by the Talmud itself. And for this, I want to just read a short story about someone who prayed the Amidah in the Talmud, and not to look at the theological implications of this, which are profound, but to look at the methodological implications of interpretation. So here I'm on source 5. There was once one who prayed the Amidah before Rabbi Hanina and said, "The great, mighty, awesome, powerful, strong, courageous God." In the Hebrew, Ha'el Agadol Hagibor V'Hanora Ha'adir V'Achazak V'Amitz. Rabbi Hanina said to him, "Have you exhausted all the possible praise of your master? Were it not that they were written by Moses in the Torah and affixed by the men of the great assembly, we would not even dare to utter those 3 descriptions. But you go on adding all of these. It may be compared to a human king who had thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and people praised him for owning silver. Isn't that a terrible degradation of him?" So now again, bracketing the theological claim of Rabbi Hanina, which we may or may not get back to, what is he saying methodologically? The only way that I can pray is by noticing that the words of prayer are actually found written by Moses in the Torah. And indeed, if Moses hadn't written them, I wouldn't be able to ascribe adjectives to God. So when you look for the biblical intertext, it opens up, I want to argue, some possibilities. And just to see that that intertext does exist, Moses wrote it in the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 17. It's the next source on the sheet. "For God your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, who shows no favor and takes no bribe, who does justice for the orphan and the widow, loves the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. You too must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Now, the context here of this phrase, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora, is totally different from the one in the Amidah, which we may have associated with a more cosmic God, right? A creator God, a God who is going to be great, mighty, and awesome by dint of the fact that God created the universe. But here we have a different context in which God is acting in an ethical way towards people who are most vulnerable. Now this, I would argue, opens up some possibilities of interpretation, which I'm not going to go into now. See previous lectures. But the methodology is one that I want to focus on. Even as early as the Talmud, Rabbi Hanina is pointing out, you have another text that stands behind the prayer. Now that we've established the methodology of connecting biblical text to the liturgy, the religious question creeps back in. What is the interpretive advantage of linking texts one to another? And here I'm going to restate the problem as a religious one. What does one do when one encounters a prayer that is troublesome? Or to ask it somewhat less provocatively, what do I do when I encounter words that I simply don't connect to, that are uninteresting to me, or I can't find a way into them? There is a rabbi named Rabbi Pinchas of Turka who claimed that the words of prayer are mishbetzot zahav, drawing on the image from Vayikra, weavings of gold that need to be filled with kavanah. But what if I can't fill the words with kavanah? They're meant to be filled, but I can't do it. How am I supposed to approach that problem? Now, ultimately, the academic approaches are lacking. The philological and the form criticism method, they offer little assistance. As Hoffman notes in his critique of them, every liturgist has thus been in the uncomfortable position of lecturing on the origin of this or that prayer, only to be asked by a layperson why we prayed in the first place. In other words, it doesn't matter how old the prayer is or when it was written or if it's the original one, if you can't tell me why I have to say it, right? What does it mean? What does it mean religiously? The alternative is simple textual archaeology, but it has nothing really to, which may be of scholarly interest, but it has nothing to do with our interest here, which is a religious one. Now, even Hoffman's method of holism, while much wider in scope, it sets aside the thorny issues of the text itself. And it instead analyzes deeper anthropological issues about the people who are saying the text, but leaves the interpretation of the text for an unanswered question. Now, I want to speak a little bit about how modern movements have dealt with this question of interpretation or difficult issues in text before coming to our methodology and putting it to use. All of the modern movements have approached what I would describe as three reactions to what do I do with a difficult text or a text that I don't connect to. And I'll lay them out for you here. Number one, cut. Number two, rewrite. And number three, interpret. Now, some of these are somewhat obvious associations with various movements, and so we don't have to belabor that point, although I did want to bring one from the early reformers, which I thought was just fascinating from a process standpoint. In the 7th session of the First Rabbinical College, which took place in Brunswick in 1844, there was a vote that was held about Kol Nidre. This is in Yana Dioma. Okay? And you have here in source 7 the minutes, which I will just quote directly. The discussion is declared concluded. The question is now asked. Should the conference declare that the oath of a Jew invoking the name of God is binding without any further ceremony? Remember, Kol Nidre is something that calls into question whether Jews can hold on to oaths as serious acts. Unanimous response, yes. Does the conference declare that Kol Nidre is unessential? And will the members of the conference in their spheres of jurisdiction work for its abolition already in time for next Kippur? Yes. Okay, so we have the cutting recorded in the minutes from 1844. And while this approach is obviously popular among Reform and Reconstructionist liturgies, some of which we'll look at in a minute, it also shows up in conservative and even Orthodox liturgy or liturgical approaches. Just wanted to highlight two of those right now. Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, in his excellent essay called Accepting Ishei Yisrael with Love, which actually was originally his senior sermon delivered, I believe, in 1998, he pointed to the conservative movement's cutting of the phrase Ishei Yisrael, which is found in the 17th blessing of the Amidah, because it refers to the issue of sacrifice. Now, writing at the introduction of the 1945 Silverman Siddur, those of you who remember it, Ashrei, page 132, we'll note that this introduction was offered by Robert Gordon, one of the leaders of the conservative movement at the time. He says in source 8, in Ritzeh, that's the name of the 17th blessing, which is itself a modification of the ancient prayer utilized by the officiating priests in the temple, the words V'Ishei Yisrael could not be reinterpreted. When these two words are deleted, the prayer becomes a fervent plea for restoration of the center of our faith to Jerusalem. Okay? So the idea of the conservative movement deciding to cut certain words because in Gordis's words, they could not be reinterpreted, is the genesis of all that sort of slow disintegration of the sacrificial imagery in conservative prayer books. But most interestingly, actually, last month, there was a blog post in the modern Orthodox world by Rabbi Yosef Kanevsky, which sort of rollicked that world, such as it is, where he was talking about his recommendation to cut the fairly controversial blessing, Shelo Asani Isha, who has not made me a woman, which dates back to the time of Rabbi Meir and shows up in the Talmud and in the Tosefta. Now he writes in source 9, I know, of course, that you have not made me a woman can be understood in many different ways. In other words, he's opening the possibility of interpretation. But by its plain meaning and by the simple smell test, it has the effect today of justifying our lack of progress and of affirming for us that women do not possess the spiritual dignity that men do. In our specific time, given our specific challenges, the blessing hurts us. We thus find ourselves today in an halachic shat hadchak, an urgent circumstance, the sort of circumstance that justifies utilizing an ingenious halachic stratagem to effectively drop this blessing from our liturgy. And so he argues further on in the blog post about what it means to not say that blessing anymore. Now, I bring these examples to show that all movements in various times and places have utilized the idea of cutting. And if you want to go historically backwards on changes in Jewish liturgy, which is the new book published by Daniel Sperber, goes through some of the more traditional cuttings of liturgy as well. Okay, so ends the cutting approach, and you don't need me to explain to you how to cut words from the liturgy. The second approach I wanted to look at briefly is the option of rewriting. Now, again, we can find examples here from various movements. I wanted to bring one that actually predates the traditional 19th century denominational divide related to the text of Lecha Dodi. Just because it's interesting, we don't even think about it often. Lecha Dodi itself, penned in the 16th century, was a somewhat controversial prayer. It wasn't introduced into most prayer services until much later after it was written. And when it was introduced, there were certain people who took objection to it, and they figured they could solve the problem by rewriting it. So if you look at source number 10, there is this issue of the author of the Chemdat Yamim, which was published back in 1731, decided that he didn't like the references to Galut, to the diaspora on Shabbat. Why should you be telling me about, Mikdash Melech Ir Melucha Kumit Se'i Mitocha Hafecha, right? Ravlach Shevet Be'emek Habacha. I don't want to talk about Emek Habacha, the Valley of Tears, on Shabbat. So he simply rewrote the line, which I brought for you in source 10. Or to take a literal approach to Lecha Dodi, the author of the Yosef Ometz, who died in 1637, rewrote the stanza that starts, Likrat Shabbat Lechu Ben Elcha. Let's go out to greet the Sabbath. He didn't like that. Why? Because his people weren't actually going anywhere. So it didn't reflect reality. Okay, this is a literal interpretation of Lecha Dodi. So he wrote instead, Libavtini Shabbat Malka. Right? It's an emotional relationship to Shabbat, the queen, but not a physical going out, and therefore he rewrote the prayer. But it was really only in the 19th and 20th centuries that the ideological articulations of why I should rewrite something started to emerge. And standing here in the West End Synagogue, I would be remiss if I did not mention Mordechai Kaplan. So Mordechai Kaplan and his Reconstructionist colleague, Eugene Cohn, wrote their theory of rewriting in the introduction to their Siddur, which was published back in 1945. And this you can see in source number 12. This is an incredible statement about what it means to pray as a rationalist. So just pay attention to this. People expect a Jewish prayer book to express what a Jew should believe about God, Israel, and the Torah, and about the meaning of human life and the destiny of mankind. We must not disappoint them in that expectation. But unless we eliminate from the traditional text statements of beliefs that are untenable and of desires which we do not or should not cherish, we mislead the simple and alienate the sophisticated. It was a simpler world back then. It was A or B. The simple will accept the false with the true to the detriment of their spiritual growth. In other words, they won't be able to distinguish the interpretation. And the sophisticated will feel that a Jewish service has little value for people of modern mentality. Rather than leaving such questionable passages to reinterpretation, we should omit or revise them. Okay? So the whole strategy of reinterpretation was really on the table for Kaplan because he didn't think that people could handle it. And he may be right. In other words, it's a strong challenge to the idea of reinterpretation, one that's seen in all these examples of people who have decided to rewrite or to cut. Now, I want to delve a little bit into a moment in liturgical history that was sort of the showdown in Atlantic City, which was the place of the Rabbinical Assemblies, Conservative Movement Rabbinical Assemblies Conference back in 1953. They gathered at the Breakers Hotel, which is one of the fancy hotels in Atlantic City, and the showdown was set. On the first night, Abraham Joshua Heschel was to speak, and on the second night, Rabbi Eugene Cohn, this representative of Reconstructionist Judaism, was to speak, and they basically presented competing ideologies to this core question. So I'll start with Cohn, and he says, source number 13, ideologies designed to exalt the group at the expense of other groups, authoritarian interpretations of nature and history, all are present in the text of traditional prayers. The elimination of such ideas from our liturgical text is necessary if our worship is to be a source of personal as well as social self-fulfillment. Now, the key here is self-fulfillment, which is already shows you where he's going to get into the showdown with Heschel. But fundamentally, the idea is there are objectionable ideas in the Siddur. We have to deal with them by excising them. Okay? And of course, the Reconstructionist Siddur is filled with those rewritings. Most famously, instead of saying God who chose us, Asher Bachar Banu, it's God who drew us near to his worship, Asher Kervanu La'avodato. Okay, so far I've described the most popular strategies when it comes to facing a question of liturgical challenge, that is cutting and rewriting. But there is a third option, and it's best represented by Heschel. As I mentioned, at that same Rabbinical Assembly convention, Heschel took the podium the night before, and speaking before 187 rabbis in late June, he started off with an apology. He said, in advancing some critical remarks, I do not mean, chas v'shalom, to take a superior attitude. In all honesty, my criticism will be, to a considerable degree, self-criticism. And then a few sentences later, he really lets loose. Our services are conducted with pomp and precision. The rendition of the liturgy is smooth. Everything is present, decorum, voice, ceremony. But one thing is missing, life. Has the temple become a graveyard where prayer is buried? Now, to be fair, Heschel was pointing out in his own provocative language a fact about synagogue life that was already fairly widespread and accepted by the time of that convention. Writing 8 years earlier in that introduction to the Reconstructionist Siddur, Cohn himself wrote, the motions survive, the emotions have fled. He goes on to say, the lips move, but the heart is unmoved. Unless this apathy to synagogue services is overcome, it will spell the end of worship among Jews. So the problem was clear to both of these men, and yet their solution couldn't have been more different. Heschel, anticipating Cohn's approach, proposed his own path for reviving prayer. He writes, the problem is not how to revitalize prayer. The problem is how to revitalize ourselves. Religious movements in our history have often revolved around the problem of liturgy. To Kabbalah and Hasidism, the primary problem was how to pray. To the modern movements, the primary problem is what to say. What has Hasidism accomplished? It inspired worship in a vast number of Jews. What have the moderns accomplished? They have inspired the publication of a vast number of prayer books. Now, Heschel has a great style here, but there's something true to what he's saying. Once you start the editing and cutting, there's really no end, as Kohelet says, there's no end to books. Now, Cohn called for a constant rewriting of the Siddur. In other words, he imagined that rewriting the Siddur in every age was the goal. Of course, you couldn't have a static liturgy. And I, living in 1953, am not going to presume that I'm going to have a Siddur that's going to last till 2011. He says, the traditional rituals must be studied as artistic forms of religious expression, which in every age need to be re-examined from the point of view of their truth and their relevance to the spiritual needs and interests of the time. This is back when truth was attainable. Whatever is merely archaic and no longer awakens religious thought and emotion, even in those who are familiar with its traditional meaning, must be discarded. Okay, that's his approach. But finally, I would just want to quote Heschel here as a wrap-up of this section, and then we'll move into our methodology. Heschel responds, really anticipates by saying, we must learn how to study the inner life of the words that fill the world of our prayer book. Without intense study of their meaning, we feel indeed bewildered when we encounter the multitude of those strange, lofty beings that populate the inner cosmos of the Jewish spirit. It's not enough to know how to translate Hebrew into English. It is not enough to have met a word in the dictionary and to have experienced unpleasant adventures with it in the study of grammar. A word has a soul, said Heschel, and we must learn how to attain insight into its life. This is our affliction. We do not know how to look across a word to its meaning. We forgot how to find the way to the word, how to be on intimate terms with a few passages in the prayer book. Familiar with all the words, we are intimate with none. The same word may evoke new understanding when read with an open heart. What we need, said Heschel, is a sympathetic prayer book exegesis. Okay, this is Heschel's call, not for cutting, not for rewriting, but exegesis. Sympathetically, interpretation, deep interpretation, opening the soul of the words. Okay, I want to, with all humility, see, Heschel was opposed to actually spelling out practical examples of this sympathetic prayer book exegesis, much to the frustration of his adherents. And with all humility, I want to offer an attempt to apply this literary intertext method as a way of approaching what Heschel was calling for. I want to interpret, and I want to do that in a rigorous, grounded, yet open process of discovering multiple meanings within the phrases of the liturgy. And I'm going to spell out the theoretical here, and then we're going to apply it to this line in Havdalah. Here's the theoretical. It's a 5-step process. Step 1, approach the liturgy from a standpoint of poetry, in which allusions abound and the surface rendering is never enough. Ask questions about the phrase. What is strange? What needs explaining? That is to say, open up the word as having possible multiple meanings. Step 2, using the academic approach of philology and academic inquiry, establish as many parallels to that liturgical text as you possibly can. Drawing from rabbinic sources, from the Geniza, from varied rites, you can see the choices that any particular liturgist is making when you see the array of all of the versions of that prayer. Step number 3, identify the intertext or intertexts that are at play in any given liturgical expression. Now, most of the time, this is going to be a biblical statement I'm arguing, following Abu Draham's approach. But there may be some Talmudic intertext at play as well. Step 4, take that intertext and understand how Chazal, our sages, read the intertext. That is to say, the Bible, a text that we apparently have no problem reading, not always literally, Chazal had approach to interpreting that. So if I find an intertext, which is in the Bible, I need not only how to understand that text in its biblical context, but also how to understand how Chazal viewed that text. Right? So it's a 3-step process. I find the prayer, I find the intertext, and I understand how Chazal read the intertext. And finally, you do interpretation with the open meanings that are available to us through the intertext and through the Chazal's understanding of the intertext. Those juxtapositions actually lead to a fruitful, grounded, hopefully rigorous approach to interpretation. Okay, I'll say one last point about methodology, then we're going to dive into the example. The combination of steps 3 and 4 is critical. That is to say, locating the biblical text and identifying its biblical context, and then the understanding of the text from Chazal. That is to say, I can't only understand the text from the Bible, I need to understand how Chazal read it. Why? Because for Chazal, the people who were actually praying these words, the biblical text rang in multiple ways. They understood it as the biblical text, and they understood it as the interpretive version of that. And Neil Kozlodoy in Source 19, which we're not going to read, has a good expression of how that actually played out for the person who was saying those words. Okay, let's test this methodology with a fairly well-known and probably benign phrase from Havdalah, Hamavdil ben yom hashvi'i l'sheshet yemei hama'aseh. I picked this phrase partially because it illustrates the method, but also because not every line in the liturgy has to get us all into hackles, okay? Right? The idea of, when I'm trying to say that God separated between the 7th day and the 6 days of work, that's a core Jewish concept that I would argue most people can get behind. Okay, what it looks like, how you do it, that's a whole other story. But the conceptual idea is something that perhaps still lives on in this modern Jewish world. Now, Havdalah itself is an appropriate liturgy to demonstrate the methodology for two reasons. Number one, liturgical historians love Havdalah. Why? Because there are many, many texts and variants of Havdalah. Some of us studied some of those texts in Psachim that we did here for a couple summers at the yeshiva. But the amazing thing about Havdalah is there's actually an explicit expression by Chazal of the methodology related to Havdalah. And you can see this in source 20 or in 21, when Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi makes the following statement about Havdalah. He says, Hamavdil sarich sheomar mein Havdalot ha'amurot b'Torah. He says that the one who does Havdalah has to mention the essence of, that is me'ein, a reference to the Havdalot, the separations that were mentioned in the Torah. In other words, when I'm putting together Havdalah, and I want to do Hamavdil bein X and Y, the X and Y have to refer to the Bible, says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Right? He's calling upon this idea of an intertext when one constructs the idea of Havdalah. Now, if we were looking for more provocative texts, we could have gone with the idea of Hamavdil ben Yisrael Amim, right? Which may raise up some hackles. Certainly the Reconstructionists wrote about this in their Siddur when they said, we should not retain the traditional text of those prayers, which make invidious comparisons between Israel and the other nations, right? Hamavdil Bein Yisrael La'amim can be a challenge for those of us who don't want to have so many Havdalot between Yisrael and Amim, if you're thinking of that in a literal sense. Okay, we're not going that way, but what I want to say is that Hamavdil Bein Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheshet Yemei HaMaaseh can open up an alternative reading of those other lines in Havdalah, including perhaps the more problematic one. Now, let's take the methodology in turn. What's interesting about this line? Bein Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheshet Yemei HaMaaseh. What do you think it's referring to? Just off the bat, on Saturday night, what event am I recalling here? Ben Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheish Yemei HaMaaseh. Sorry? Breshit Aleph, right? Creation. After all, what is Shabbat? It is a reflection of the timetable that's set out in Breshit Aleph. And therefore, I would expect Yom HaShvi'i Sheishet Yemei HaMaaseh reflecting Breshit Aleph. But here's what's interesting. When you look at Breshit Aleph, you do not have the word lehavdil associated with Shabbat and the other 6 days. You have Vayechal, who concluded. You have Vayishbot, who ceased. You have Vayivarech, who blessed. But you do not have any form of Havdalah. There's no lehavdil related to the 7th day and the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1. Now that's already interesting, right? Why didn't they just choose something that would express Genesis 1? What else could we be referring to here? Okay, now step 2 is to figure out where the line comes from in the larger Havdalah liturgy. And I want to hear, I'm not going to look at all the extant manuscripts of Psachim 103b and 104b, but I want to point to one source from the Geniza which actually helps us make our case. It's amazing. In all those manuscripts of the Talmud, it always says some version of Ben Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheish Yemei HaMaaseh. Some of them have Ubein Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheish Yemei HaMaaseh, but no significant difference. But in one of the texts of Havdalah from the Geniza, which you can see in source 23, there is a reference not to Ben Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheish Yemei HaMaaseh, but Ben HaShabbat L'Sheish Yemei HaMaaseh. What's the difference between Yom HaShvi'i and Shabbat? There's no real substantive difference, but from an intertextual detective standpoint, it's very significant because the intertext that we're looking towards actually has Shabbat very prominently mentioned. And now I want to move towards that step. Step number 3, where we actually move to the intertext. The intertext is easily found here because Sheishet Yemei HaMaaseh shows up only one time in the entire Tanakh. And what's amazing about that text from the Geniza is that the person who was rewriting Havdalah had that intertext in mind when he either consciously or unconsciously substituted the word Shabbat for Yom HaShvi'i, because let's see the intertext play out, and you can see how that actually was the understanding of this juxtaposition. So it's from Yechezkel, chapter 46. And here, I'll just read the first line in Hebrew. Ko amar Hashem Elohim, Sha'ar hechatzer ha'pnimit ha'poneh kadim, Yesagur Sheishet Yemei HaMaaseh, Uvayom HaShabbat Yipateach, Uvayom HaChodesh Yipateach. Right? The idea is that the east gate of the inner court will be closed during the 6 days, the 6 working days, but open on the Sabbath, HaShabbat, and on the new moon. And the text goes on to describe how the Nasi enters the sanctuary in that day of openness. Now, I've already identified how Shabbat is clear here, but the idea that we have a biblical intertext, I think, is significant only once we start to understand the deeper biblical context. So I've got my Havdalah text, I've got my intertext, I got the Geniza that helped me prove that the intertext is the intertext, and now I'm going to describe the biblical context of that intertext. Then we'll move to Chazal. The biblical context is one in which we actually have somewhat of a problem, because our text in Ezekiel said the door is closed except on Shabbat and holidays, right? But now in chapter 44 we have another interpretation or another statement about the door, and it says, "Vayashaboti derech shar hamikdash hachitzon paneh kadim v'hu sagur." The door, that very door, was closed. Vayomer Elie Hashem, Hashar hazeh sagur yihiyeh, lo yipateach, v'ish lo yavo bo, ki Hashem Elohei Yisrael ba bo, v'haya sagur. Nobody can open this door, says chapter 44, because that is the door through which Hashem entered the sanctuary. Okay? So what we have here is 2 contrasting images of the door. In chapter 46, which is our intertext, we have the door opens at certain periods. And in chapter 44, we have a door that never opens. Now, let's see how Chazal dealt with this conflict. It's somewhat ingenious. If you look at the Mishnah in source 26, you'll see that the Mishnah basically imagines a gate, a sha'ar, where there were 2 sub-doors. One of them, the south one, was always closed, because that's the one from chapter 44. And one of them, the north one, would open on Shabbat. Right? That's the one in which we're talking about in chapter 46, the one in which the Nasi could enter. So Chazal actually harmonizes this reading into the Mishnah, where they're describing the physical layout of the temple. Okay, now we've identified the intertexts, and we've identified Chazal's understanding of the intertext. Now let's advance an initial interpretation before we go back to one other Chazal text. The initial interpretation I want to say is this. And here I would just argue that the whole idea of interpretation is one that's open. That's to say, once you set up the building blocks for the interpretation, I in some ways throw it out to you. And that's the idea of what it means to have a prayer that has multiple meanings. So when I put forth an interpretation here, it's not ultimately the only interpretation. I'm now giving you pshat. It's looking at language as having multiple expressions. And that's really what I want to, in that spirit, I want to put forth an interpretation here. What we have in the initial understanding of this line is a temporal relationship to God and holy time. There are 6 days of work, and the 7th day is the day of rest. But what the intertext has taken us to is one in which we move from time to space. Right? We often think, thanks to Heschel, of the idea of Shabbat actually moving us from space to time. But what we have here is a physical expression of the spatial elements of what it means to move from Shabbat to the 6 days of work. And how is that spatial element represented? It's represented by a door, right? The door fundamentally is the image of the relationship. Is that door open? Is that door closed forever? Did you experience Shabbat as an open door? Do you experience Havdalah as a moment when the gates are closing, as it were? How do you experience the 6 days of the week in which God is behind a closed door? Is that an image that actually speaks to you, that adds some emotional valence to what it means to recite Havdalah? In other words, if Havdalah is just a rehearsal of the cosmic separation of 6 days and the 7th day, it's sort of like, okay, I got that on my calendar, my G calendar, I understand the concept. But what if Havdalah was actually forcing you to confront what is your relationship with Hashem? How is that relationship different on Shabbat? And how is that relationship expressed in the metaphor of an open or a closed door? Now, to sort of complicate that relationship metaphor one step further, I want to bring one other intertext, and that's the one you'll see in source number 27, which is an expression of this whole idea of the door from Rabbi Yehuda, who really emphasizes the further expression of relationship. It says, Rabbi Yehuda says, on holidays and Shabbatot, Israel sits there and sees the doors open in front of them and knows that the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is there. as it says, and then it quotes Ezekiel that Hashem came into it. That is, say, chapter 44. What do? Immediately they fall and prostrate before God, both in the past and in the future, says Rabbi Yehuda, as it says, and the nation will, I'm adding in parentheses, prostrate at the opening of that gate on Shabbatot and holidays. V'hishtachavu. It's a play on whether is that referring to the past or to the future. But so we're sort of playing with the idea of time, which we thought was fairly clear in Havdalah, right? Present, let's say. But fundamentally, we're even moving beyond the image of time to say, how do I react to a peering through the door, right? When I see, as it were, when I see the sanctuary, what is my response? I'm prostrate all of a sudden, right? I react to that open door in a form of worship. And I think that adds another layer of the relationship here. It's a layer of longing, right? It's a layer of not being in direct connection with God on the other side of the door, but really looking through the door, right? That's the religious stance that's taken by the Israelites described here by Rabbi Yehuda. What does it mean for the door to open, for me to wish that I were on the other side, to connect, to worship as a way of drawing near, right? And what would it mean for Havdalah to be a recognition or an evaluation of my longing for Hashem, right? It's not a cosmic calendar, or not only a cosmic calendar, it's also a challenge of accessing the idea of what is our relationship with God. Am I seeing the door open? Did I experience that sense of longing? And how do I react to that sense of longing, perhaps in the model of the ancient Israelites described by Rabbi Yehuda? Okay, I'm going to skip the final image here from Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, but suffice it to say that you can go further with the other rabbinic understandings of this intertext to continue to layer and layer other interpretations of what it means to say this line. But I want to conclude the idea of Havdalah and the reinterpretation by going back to that perhaps more difficult phrase, Ben Yisrael la'amim. When I say the text of Havdalah, am I describing a specific individual separation between the 6 days and the 7th day, or am I describing a larger category metaphor? And if it's the latter, which I'm arguing for, Bein Yom HaShvi'i L'Sheshet Yemei HaMa'aseh, that is, it's both a cosmic calendar and it's a representation of longing, how does that relate to the other lines in Havdalah? When I say Bein Or L'Choshech, am I saying literally between that light on and that light off, between the candle being bright and the candle being blown out? Or is there some larger sort of meta sense of light and darkness as a deep metaphor that is multivalent? Right? In fact, the idea of Havdalah with light and darkness shows up on day 1 and day 4. So already you're forced to ask yourself, what is the difference between the sun and the moon and the light and the darkness of day 1? And so I would argue that you're getting to a place where Havdalah is describing literary categories as opposed to specific events. And that brings us to the idea of Ben Yisrael la'amim. Ben Yisrael la'amim could be specifically me as a Jew, separate from this other person as a non-Jew. Or it could be another typology, another deeper metaphor. If all of the other ones, Kodesh and Chol we didn't talk about, but that's sort of self-evident as a category of larger metaphor, right? Holy and profane. So if all of the other ones are categories of metaphors, in what way could Yisrael Amim also be a category of a metaphor? Now, to do the real interpretation there, you'd have to do the intertext for that text, which has all other interesting twists and turns, because in most texts it's actually Yisrael L'Goyim instead of Amim, which may be a synonym, but actually points you to different texts in the Bible. We're not going to go down that road, but I just wanted to offer the possibility that you can take a text, a line in a text, and the implication of the interpretation actually spills out into other lines of that text, which may have initially been more troubling. Okay, I'm going to conclude in the last 5 minutes here with another example of this interpretation. Some of you have heard me do this, but I'm going to record it for posterity. And also to say that this is a complicated method of interpretation, and you don't always have to go every step 1 through 5 to get to some meaningful place. And so I want to do that with the last line of the first blessing of the Amida, which really is only we're going to sort of shorthand it by just going through steps 1, 3, and 5. Skipping the variants in the Geniza and skipping the idea of Chazal's interpretation, but getting to a sense of what a reinterpretation could be by locating an intertext. So the last line in the Amida reads, Baruch Atah Hashem, Magen Avraham, shield of Abraham. Now to take the methodology, I'll ask questions on that text. why is that text only mentioning Abraham? Why isn't it mentioning, to pick other people, Yitzchak and Yaakov, who showed up earlier in the bracha? Why isn't it mentioning Sarah? Why isn't it mentioning any other Jewish character? What is so special about Abraham that Abraham gets, front and center in the first blessing of the Amidah? And secondly, what is the image of Magen? Right? We often focus on the person, but what about the image of shield? What is the function of shield? What do you imagine that shield to be? So now let's locate the biblical intertext. There's actually two places in which God is a shield for Abraham. One is in chapter 14 of Genesis, which we're not going to look at, and one is in chapter 15, which we are going to look at here. And to look at that one in chapter 15, we'll read that first line. It says, after those things, the word of Hashem came to Avram in a vision, saying, don't fear, Avram, I am a shield for you. Anochi magen lach. Your reward will be very great. So my question on the biblical text is, what is Abraham's fear? What is he so afraid of that God has to say, al tira, don't be afraid? Now, we can actually, the commentators offer their interpretation. The pshat, I would argue, is found in the next few psukim. So let's read those. Avram said, Lord Hashem, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless? And the one in charge of my household is Damesek Eliezer. Avram said, since you've granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir. So what is Avram afraid of? He's afraid that the promise of having children is not going to be fulfilled. Right? He looks around and he says, Damesek Eliezer, this servant of mine, is the closest I have to an heir. And you, God, promised me that I'm going to have a child. I don't see it. So how does God react? God says, that one, Damesek Eliezer, shall not be your heir. None but your very own issue shall be your heir. Then he said to him, I am Hashem who brought you out from Ur Kasdim to assign this land to you as a possession. God renews the promise that he made in chapter 12, which is not only that Avram should have kids, but that he will inherit the land. And how does Avram relate to that renewal of the promise? Avram says, Lord Hashem, how shall I know that I am to possess it? B'ma'idaki irashena. Now, Chazal, we're not going to get into this too deeply, but Chazal identify this as a moment in which Bnei Israel were punished because of Avram's lack of faith. That's why they go into Egypt, which is the next part of the story in Genesis, because Avram basically is not able to believe that God's going to give Avram kid and that God's going to give Avram the land. But fundamentally, I want to take that interpretive license not from the negative side, but from the positive side, which is to say two things. Number one, Avram, as the central character of that first blessing of the Amidah, is not the Avram that we often think about, especially at this time of year, who is prepared to sacrifice his only son, the ultimate believer, the ultimate knight of faith. Avram there is the doubter, perhaps the ultimate doubter, right? The one who challenges God when God actually develops straight out promises. And it's in that spirit that I think we can perhaps step into Avram's shoes when we recite that first blessing of the Amidah. Not all the time, not every day, but in moments of doubt, there is an opening to enter that text in a way in which you're not the first Jew to have doubts about God. And in fact, it's encoded in the core text of prayer. And finally, to say that what is the relationship that a doubter can have with Hashem? It's not an either or. It's not one where I can choose either to be a doubter and therefore out of the conversation, or to have perfect faith and therefore to be in dialogue with God. Avram is in deep dialogue with God from a position of doubt. And that, I would argue, is a deep expression of what fundamentally prayer is all about. When we say that the Amidah expresses our longings, it's a longing that may be born out of some sprinkling, some overlay of not being sure, of doubt, of not sure that the promises are coming true. And nevertheless, prayer is open to us. In fact, the most significant prayer is open to us. Chazal say that, there's a debate about this, but the majority opinion is that if you don't have kavanah, if you don't have intention for that first bracha, then you have not fulfilled the requirement of the Amidah. So what would it mean to fulfill the requirement of prayer in a prayer that highlights a biblical character who's filled with doubt? Now again, that's my interpretation. You can offer your own. I'm really here to offer a methodology in which these otherwise flat lines of prayer are opened up for a deeper investigation. And basically with that, I'm going to close with two quotes from Heschel. in his writings on prayer, Heschel counseled, words have fullness and depth. They are multidimensional. To begin to pray is to confront the word. Changing the word, I want to argue, won't ultimately work. We need to confront that word. And I hope that this methodology offers us an approach, a grounded approach, of how to confront the word. Finally, the Siddur must not be used as a scapegoat. A revision of the prayer book will not solve the crisis of prayer. What we need is a revision of the soul, a new heart, rather than a new text. It's my hope, it's my prayer, that this method of interpretation will open up new avenues to the expression of the soul. Thank you. We have time for some questions. I don't know if we have a mic or that's... John, just speak up because no one online can hear you.
Do you think that, granted that Heschel's direction is the one that you sort of convinced me to be most sympathetic with to begin with, but do you think that there's a limit to Heschel's fine thinking? I mean, might there be a point in the liturgy where you just can't do it? Like, for example, Shiloh Asani.
Right.
Is there some point where you just have to put your hands up and say, and then what happens? Do you change it, or do you respond with silence? What's the game there? And is it relevant to the related question, where in the liturgy it stands? I mean, it seems to me that one thing to revise the Hadar, it's another thing to revise a bracha and a Shmona Esrei. I'm not sure what the precise halakhic difference is, but I think there probably is one.
Okay, great. I think that, just to repeat John's question briefly, is there a limit to Heschel's approach? Is there a moment when you actually can't say the word anymore? It's actually amazing. In his article, Jeremy Kalmanovsky's article, he really takes the folks of the conservative movement to task on Ishei Yisrael, and yet he starts off his article by saying, I don't know anybody who says Shelo Asani Isha. In other words, he's saying there is a limitation to the mode of interpretation. And I think the question there that I have, that I sort of approach with some sense of ultimate humility, is how am I supposed to know where to draw that line? I think Yosef Kanetsky was sort of getting at that by saying it could be reinterpreted, but in our moment, with our particular situation, it can't. And you don't want to trick anybody with that. Now, there are interpretations that have been offered for Shelo Asani Isha that are sympathetic to the problem that is at hand. Like, for instance, it says in Psalm 100, Hu asanu velo anachnu. And there's a Kri Ketiv issue there. The Kri Ketiv is low with an aleph, is low with a vav. So one scholar, this is a few years ago in the journal Sinai, actually proposed the reading of Shelo Asani Isha is not who did not make me a woman, but who made me a woman of his, right? Shelo with a vav, Asani Isha. Okay? So in other words, and for all of the blessings, right? Shelo Asani Aved, who made me a servant of God, right? So it's an interesting method of interpretation. I think the other way you could go in interpreting that blessing is Isha, right? Does Isha mean the literal woman who is populating the world in the 21st century right now? Or is Isha a category that actually nobody in their right mind, XY or XX chromosome, would want to be in the ancient world because of the status that it held? In other words, if you think about this as a historical category as opposed to a gender essentialist term in the modern age, you may have another approach to interpretation. Right? Now, I mean, I grew up and I say, Shasani B'Tzalmo, this is Minhag Avotenu B'Yadenu in some ways, which is a very recent minhag, in the length of Jewish liturgy. But I think that I would like to push towards a direction. I mean, it'd be interesting what Heschel would have said to that. I'm dying to know if he said it or not, if there's anything that he would have cut or rewrote. And certainly there's halachic levels of that. L'chadodi you could rewrite more easily than you could rewrite those three core blessings that Rabbi Meir said. But I think that we have completely denigrated the possibility of interpretation, such that I think we're so quick to pull the trigger on the cutting and the rewriting. Yeah, Bethany.
So, thank you. Overall, I really, in general, buy into this methodology, and this is kind of an analog question, and so I'm not exactly sure how much more you want to add to it. But I sometimes, I deeply appreciate this notion that you would want to reinterpret prayer, but I sometimes wonder what responsibility we have for taking ownership of the fact that that some of our prayers can actually be interpreted in a very negative way. Meaning, yes, I want to own my tefillah and say, isn't my tefillah beautiful? I can reinterpret it in all these wonderful ways. But what responsibility do I have for my neighbor who decides to reinterpret it in all sorts of negative ways?
Right. Okay. So that's a great question, which is basically, what is my responsibility if I could come up with an interpretation? I know what I'm saying, but what's my responsibility in terms of, I assume, otherwise rewriting the prayer such that my neighbor doesn't make a wrong decision? Or as Kaplan put it, and I think he sort of essentialized it, but nevertheless was an issue, the simple-minded are not expected to go through all these steps and methodologies to come up to a sort of an appropriate interpretation. I would say there, it's a larger question also of the question of how you deal with difficult texts in the Jewish canon in general. In other words, how do you deal with the text in the Torah that you don't like? And what gives you the permission to rewrite? Now, I don't think we're at the stage now where people are actually rewriting the Torah. I think people are still in the stage of reinterpreting the Torah. Now, that may get to John was hinting at sort of the authority question behind the text. People see the Siddur, you see the sausage being made with the Siddur in Chazal, so you have some sense of, oh, this is something I could work with here, as opposed to the Torah. Right? But fundamentally, I would say that the strategies of reinterpretation, let's put it this way. Religion misuses text all the time. You can pick your favorite example. And I would say that, one normal strategy about that would be like, let's cut out all dangerous religious texts. Perhaps people will be nicer. But it seems to me like, the baddies are going to be baddies, and fundamentally they're going to find another way of doing that. So I don't know. I guess it's a deeper question of how you deal with difficult texts in the canon. And I would just say what I'm trying to do here is to at least elevate the Siddur to the level of interpretive approach that we reserve for the Bible and perhaps for other difficult rabbinic texts. Nobody's going through the project of rewriting the rabbinic texts that are problematic. They're either not reading them or they're trying to reinterpret them. And I would say that for the Siddur, which we do read, I want to push for reinterpretation. Ben.
I really enjoy this method in general. It's really helped my own prayer experiences. But I guess I want to go back to sort of some of the stuff that was going on in the Atlantic City, the rumble in Atlantic City, and specifically to sort of how, and even before that with Kaplan's question about the simple-minded, which is sort of how does this approach work for the people who go to synagogue? I came here tonight and thoroughly enjoyed, but had to sit, I'm sitting for an hour and a half in a lecture, and we're just getting through two pieces of much larger prayers. So there's a lot of prayers in that Siddur. Am I supposed? Maybe I'm another category might add to simple-minded and sophisticated might be lazy, which maybe I would count myself in. And what about the person who just doesn't have the patience or time, or maybe even just the knowledge to sort of go through all this?
Right. So Ben's question is basically, I may not be simple-minded, but I have a limited amount of time, and I also may not have the ability to go through the steps of interpretation here. How am I supposed to enter into the Siddur using this methodology? And I think that, look, I would say that's the fundamental challenge of the interpretive process that I'm putting forward here. It's much easier to cut. Anybody can cut. You don't need any special background to know how to not say a word. And nevertheless, I would say that I'm not ready to give up on the project. I think that the project is going to require a lot of people lining up and doing it. I think that we're living in an age where the sort of, the internet allows you for the multiple interpretations of any text in a way that's much faster than we've gotten to in the past. I'm not sure if it's going to take place over the internet or if it's something that we just sort of engage in as a serious level of study. But what if the curriculum of what it means to teach prayer was focused on getting to this level of methodology as opposed to, let's tell you about the history of this prayer, or let's tell you about the theological problems of this prayer. I would say we spend a lot of time on those approaches. And we have a little bit of time that we could devote to this approach here. But at the end of the day, I want to say also that the prayer experience is not limited to the words. And that's where I'm going to invite you to come back next week, which is to say that I don't think you have to have an answer for every line of tefillah in order to get somewhere with tefillah. In some ways, what I want to say about this approach is I see so many people who are stuck at the door of tefillah, to use the image again, because they're saying, how can I say these words that I simply don't connect to or disagree with? But once you sort of accept in theory that not everything is what it seems on the surface, then maybe you can enter into the words without having to have every particular word justified to allow your heart to open to experience the other side of prayer, which I would argue is fundamentally the aesthetic side of prayer, and really actually which is what is keeping people away, I would argue, from the synagogue. In other words, people want to argue for you, yeah, I don't pray because I can't say these words. But really they don't pray because it's the way that Heschel described it at the beginning of this talk. The prayer service is very difficult to connect to from an emotional standpoint. So I'm sort of doing a two-pronged approach here. I want to hit you over the head with the possibility that the prayer book is more complex than you give it credit for. But instead of saying you have to interpret the entire Siddur before you can walk into Beit Knesset, I would say, okay, walk with me a little bit. You know that there's more to these prayers. Now let's say them, let's experience them, and then we can work on interpreting them as we go along. But once I've gotten you in the door, then I'm saying you're beyond the sort of initial objection to prayer, which is always based in, I can't say these words because I disagree with them. Yeah.
Is the intertextual corollary always in Bible and Talmud? Is there ever intertextuality between the Siddur stuff? Like, when you brought up the metaphor of the Sha'ar, like, immediately I thought, like, Kuli Sha'ar Tzedek and Hallel, or even, like, Nit Yilach, because we're coming up on Yom Kippur. Like, when you have repetition of the metaphors that might come from biblical allusions, is there then merit in, like, linking it back, or do you just get in, like, circles? Right.
Well, I would say just so the question is basically, are there inner Siddur links? Could you play a literary linkage game within the Siddur? Now, Pitkuli Sha'ar Tzedek is, of course, a biblical text. But if you think of, P'tach Lanu Sha'ar, right, which is what we're going to say in Yom Kippur, that's obviously linking back to that biblical text. I would say the biblical texts are, if you read Abu Draham, you just take it off the shelf. You find it on HebrewBooks.org. You look at any passage of the liturgy. It's incredible that he has found basically a biblical intertext for every line of the liturgy. He doesn't just stop, on Shabbat. But I would say that there is work to be done in linking parts of the Siddur one to another. For instance, we talked about the first blessing of the Amida, Avot, but I think that there's actually a very strong literary linkage between Avot and Hoda'ah, the second to last bracha. If you look at the words that repeat, you'll see words that don't repeat anywhere else in the Amida and words that do repeat there. They have similar length, which is much longer than most of the brachot in the weekday Amida. And there's a lot of literary themes there. So then it's a question of, well, okay, now I've linked basically the first blessing and the second to last blessing, and those are, by the way, the blessings that I bow in. Is there some literary linkage that lines up with my bodily linkage? Is there something, there's an argument that Modim was actually the last bracha of the Amida. Could that open up some windows? How is it the inverse? If Avot is looking past, Modim is looking future? There's ways to play with that. So I would say that there is work to be done within the Siddur. But most of the time, you'd be surprised how many biblical intertexts there are out there. Yeah.
I know that one of the sort of paraphrases that Rachel Adler says is like, we don't say what we mean when we pray. When do we really say what we mean? Like, it's not in our prayers. And so I'm curious why this approach is opposed to sort of going back, okay, seeing Magen Avot or that, Magen Avraham, okay, that's really this allusion to doubt. And so why wouldn't we then want to say, let's have the Chatima be, blessed is the one who gives us the courage to stand here in doubt. Just rewrite it, why not actually rewrite it with that valence so that it's accessible without...
Good. Okay, so once you've identified a theme that you may have uncovered through an intertext, why not just rewrite the prayer to say, blessed is the one who gives us the ability to stand in presence through doubt, or something more felicitous than that phrase that I just poorly rephrased from you. But I think that, look, this is where I want to argue about what is the project of writing prayer. And those of you who have ever tried to write a prayer, I would say you know what I'm talking about. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to write a phrase that is poetic. In other words, there's something about the Siddur that I want to argue is at stake that is more than just the communication of an ideology, right? If the Siddur is a catechism, then you can write a clearer catechism, or you can write a catechism that you believe in more, perhaps, right? But the Siddur is not a catechism. It's actually a set of poems, right? And poems are always more elegant, I think, than the expression of the particular meaning that one encounters in the poem. So in other words, you and me may experience Magen Avraham as doubt. Someone else may experience Magen Avraham as referring to the Asher Migein Sarecha Biyadecha of chapter 14, which we didn't look at, but the idea of God actually protecting me from my enemies, and doesn't want to access the doubt question. So the idea is, I would say, why not preserve a language that is open for interpretation, which offers multiple readings, as opposed to sort of getting it down to its baseline interpretation A, B, or C at any particular moment, which closes off the multiple meanings that you have there. And I would say, like, fundamentally, there's a problem of language. That's what Rabbi Hanina was getting at when he said, don't add adjectives to the Amida. Language is a terrible way of relating to God. Language is completely deficient. So when you think you're going to come up with a better language, you're not, because language, as sort of by nature, it's unable to define the infinite. So I think it's going to be difficult to come up with a better turn of phrase. Why not work with the turns of phrase that we have that already are in some dialogue with our ultimate holy text, and to come up with the possible multiple interpretations as opposed to the bottom line one that you want to hold on to right now.
I really enjoyed the talk a lot. It seems that if the major problem is cynicism, then the approach is going to be a practical approach to getting around cynicism. And most of your talk suggested a way that our head could see how to create a different kind of meaning, a kind of meaning that either wouldn't offend us or would actually be meaningful to us in terms of our intellect. But it strikes me that another solution to cynicism might be the work of the heart that you described, Heschel's pointing towards, that would change how we make meaning in a different way. That would start not with the head, but somewhere in the heart. What would that mean practically for us to teach tefillah such that people could feel the meaning of it? In Sunday school, what would it look like?
Great.
Teach it there.
Great. So Stephen's pointing to if the block is cynicism, what we've been dealing with here tonight is a sort of intellectual approach to that problem. But how do you deal with a more emotional or a heart-based approach to that problem? And how would you educate as a way of overcoming those problems? I would say that that's sort of the fundamental two-pronged approach of this lecture series. So I invite you to come back next week where we deal with the more emotive sides of tefillah. But I think your question on education is core, because the educational agenda of tefillah is almost always focused on what does this prayer mean historically, right? Who were the people who said it? When did they say it? Who were they reacting to? And what I'm always dealing with is an assumed intellectual block. Now, I've encountered enough of the intellectual block from real life people that I felt like I want to deal with that head on. But I agree with you that for me personally, the fundamental block and the cynicism, where the cynicism actually sort of pops up, is in the emotive side. Is when we're not actually calling upon the heart. You pick up the Reconstruction of Siddur. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work from a linguistic standpoint. It's saying everything I want to say in some ways. And nevertheless, I'm not sure that I'm going to feel more at home just getting over that intellectual hump. I really need to get through the emotional block there. And what would it mean think about camp. This is the difference between camp and, let's say, Hebrew school, just to take typologies of prayer education. At camp, how do we educate around tefillah? You gather everybody at a lake, you dress them up, and it's Friday night, and you start singing, right? Do I love tefillah? I love tefillah. I don't talk about morning tefillah. Fine, okay, right? And then what's the experience in Hebrew school? You sit them in a classroom, you say Aleph, Aleph, and you start teaching them the words of tefillah. Do you like tefillah? I hate tefillah, right? So there's some sense of like we have some way into the heart. It doesn't have to do with overcoming the intellectual blocks, certainly not as a fourth grader, perhaps, or maybe. But I would say that step one is to set aside the intellectual problems. Step two is really where you're driving at, which is the emotional issues, and that's hopefully what we're going to hit with me and Joey in the coming weeks. You would say, yeah. No, we have a few more minutes. So.
I guess I was a little disappointed. I don't think you really dealt with the fundamental aspect of what is prayer. What are we doing? Are we asking God for specific things? Are we expressing gratitude to God? Or are we using prayer as our prayer? And I'm thinking mostly about the Amida. Is this a way of reflecting for ourselves and motivating ourselves? And I think unless you address that question, maybe the other questions of interpretation, you can't really
Great. What are we doing? What do we mean when we pray? What is the goal of prayer, if I could say it another way? And if we don't address that deeper question, then the interpretation is sort of secondary. In this book, which I recommend, Man's Quest for God, renamed Quest for God, sort of ironic, by Abraham Joshua Heschel, he goes through the first chapter. There is really over and over again, he says, prayer is. And he's really trying to get at an approach to what prayer is, but you see through the multiple definitions that there's no one simple sentence answer to that question. I would say for Heschel, and maybe as one that's a guide for this mode of interpretation, the idea of prayer is taking yourself out of the center and realizing that there is a God to relate to. Or as we were talking about this afternoon, making yourself seen to God. Right? To have a relationship with God in which you are revealing yourself to God through prayer. Right? It's that sort of dialogue. Now, Heschel was fairly hard line about that, and that's why he went head to head with Eugene Cohen, because they had a completely different conception of God. Right? Heschel basically says, you're a lunatic if you pray and you don't believe in a God who listens to some extent, or a God who's relatable, because otherwise you're just talking to yourself. And Eugene Cohen and the Reconstructionists would say, no, what you're doing is you're sort of getting some sort of self-fulfillment going on in the prayer space. They didn't reject prayer, even though they rejected that sort of personal, relatable sense of God in some way. So I think that your question is a deep one, and it's one that, I may have assumed already as we have some sense of what we're doing in prayer, but I would say it's difficult to answer. But I would say if you're going to follow the Heschel line to its fullest, you're doing something about connecting to a God that you can relate to. And maybe that's the image, the powerful image of the door that we say on Havdalah. Everybody, the rational, can understand organizing time into 7 days. But can the rational only relate to the idea of relating, of longing towards God, of peering through the door? Right? Or is that something that's reserved for people who have an emotional connection to what it means to relate to the divine? And maybe in there is your question of what am I really doing when I'm praying? Perhaps that's part of it. Yeah.
Is this approach possible within, Reconstructionist theology per se? Because Kaplan, for example, takes God, the personal God, out of the picture in time. So does your intellectual approach only work within a particular framework of reference? So the associative reference, for example, where you're drawing on the whole pantheon of Jewish literary thought, I guess.
Right. Well, I would say that on the question of whether this could only work in a non-Kaplan ideology of God, I would say that, look, the advantage of literature is that people, we still teach English in the high schools, right? People still get behind the idea that there's such a thing as a poem and a sort of project of literature that is different from, I'm trying to communicate an idea to you only through prose. And there I feel like it's probably more widespread than just people who have a particular emotional, relatable aspect of God, like Heschel's God. And I would say, I think Kaplan's problem with reinterpretation was less about the issue of the God that you're connecting to and more about what do we expect from people in the pews. People in the pews aren't expected to go through an interpretive process, right? They're expected to have the flatline meaning as the meaning. And therefore, if the meaning, the flatline meaning, the surface meaning is the only one they're encountering, who can blame them if they're leaving the synagogue because they don't believe what it says? I would say that, where they disagreed on that question is an issue of how much credit am I giving people from an interpretive standpoint as opposed to what God do I believe in? They for sure disagreed about the latter as well, but I think that, and this is maybe the ultimate challenge to this approach, is how much credit do you have to give to the worshiper to enter into an interpretive methodology, and how much of it is sort of getting back to Ben's question, how much of it is, can I just convince you that there's more to the tefillah than the surface level? And then, we'll interpret some, we won't interpret others, but fundamentally we're in this project of not dismissing it out of hand. And I'm not sure Kaplan was willing to go that far, but I'm, I guess, suggesting an alternative.
So, following up on, her question over there, does the intertext approach allow for analysis within the same tefillah in different contexts? Like the fundamental example I'm thinking of is Kedusha, where the whole Kedusha, you pretty much have just the verses. The Shachari Kedusha for Shabbat Yom Tov, you have this spiritual image with a plea about returning to Yerushalayim. And in the Musaf Kedusha, which is more this play on words of Kodo and Min Como, and so is there a way to apply this approach within something like Kedusha, which manifests itself in probably more than three different ways?
Right. Well, I would say what F is asking is, could you apply this methodology to prayers that in our current Siddur appear in multiple formats? The weekday Kedusha versus Shacharit on Shabbat versus Musaf on Shabbat, and you could add Chagim as well. You have another line there. I think that what you're really pointing at is the idea of, if I was going to do this methodology for Kedusha, I would want to look at all of those texts as, in Heinemann's form criticism approach, as variants of the expression of Kedusha. Now, what you'll find, and actually Ezra Fleischer, who's the philologist, did the work on this, what you'll find is that all aspects, all versions of Kedusha have the two quotes, one from Isaiah 6 and one from Ezekiel 3. The Kadosh, 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 and the Baruch Kvod Hashem Kamo. And so, then it gets to a question of, well, what do I gain by adding those other biblical texts? What are those other images that are being overlaid? Why is the Shema there, right? What's the Shema doing in the middle of the Kedusha, and what could that mean from an interpretive standpoint? Normally you have, what's the answer to why is the Shema in the Kedusha? So the historical traditional answer is, well, the Romans set up guards, and they didn't allow the Jews to say the Shema. So the Jews, the Yiddish Kop, they snuck it into the Amina Kedusha, right? Because by Musaf, everybody's already spaced out. So if I say the Shema, the Roman guard won't notice, right? But, let's say, even if that's the historical accurate approach, which seems a little bit far-fetched, then I would ask that from an interpretive standpoint. What does it mean to start saying the Shema in the middle of the angelic praise of God? What is the, there are rabbinic texts that deal with that, right? They say that, the angels have to say 3 words, Kadosh, 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 before they get to say Hashem. But the Jewish people only have to say 2 words, Shema Yisrael, before they get to the word Hashem. So is there some sort of, angel versus human thing going on there? Is there some intimacy battle that's going on there in the Kedusha? I don't know, there's a lot of fruits for interpretation there, but I think that what you're pointing to is what I would have, argued as one of the steps, that is to say, finding all of the variants and then saying, okay, given that there were choices here from the author, why did they choose this one? Why did they decide to go with this one? Because they could have chose the other Kedusha. So what do I gain by going with the Kedusha that I did go with? And that's how I would start off in that interpretive approach. We have time for one more.
Can I ask something else about that? I think a cynicism point is really totally right on. I just kind of remember, I feel like I grew up being cynical, and I don't even mean that like very cynical, but just kind of cynical. I remember going to Hebrew school as a 4th grader, and I always felt like it was a Reform synagogue in Los Angeles, but I still always felt like I was like Ned Flanders or something. Like no matter how much I did it, and I guess maybe this question sort of points next week, but I guess I'm just sort of curious to hear about your take on the cynicism thing, getting past that. Because I think you're right. Getting past that is so important for all this.
Yeah, look, the cynicism thing, as I said, I think is the core issue, but it really speaks to the difficulty in praying with people who you see in other contexts and who know you from a non-religious space, I would say. How open can you really be emotionally with the guy sitting next to you in shul who, A, you're going to talk to at Kiddush, B, who is your dentist? You know what I'm saying? It's like you have relationships with people that you're davening with. And it's hard to overcome that. I think that, there I would say that the aesthetics, I would say that both me and the dentist, neither of us are showing up at shul. If you had to sort of take a survey of Judaism right now. But for the people who are at shul, I would say that, there is an emotional block that is set up by the aesthetic issues in the synagogue. This is, I think, part of the problem we'll deal with next week, but I'll just sort of foreshadow one of them I think is critical. I can see your face when we daven. And that is, Heschel talks about this, it's a source of religious embarrassment. I can't be as connected to Hashem. I can't be longing through that door of the temple if I'm looking at you and thinking about the fact that you're my dentist. And that's ultimately, I think, something that the aesthetic is going to be, you're going to have an aesthetic solution. Whether it's going to be dimming the lights or facing people in a certain way or dealing with something that would get you around the issue of how am I going to be emotionally expressive with people who I have Kiddush with. I think it's a core problem. And in some ways, that's why it's easier, I think, to daven with strangers. It's easier to have an emotional davening experience when you go to a place where you're not known, because I know everybody, you want to be welcomed and everyone's supposed to invite you over, etc. But for the moment of davening, it's like a great moment to be anonymous, because then you can actually do whatever you want, because you don't actually have a relationship with the people there. Now, is that the ultimate in community? Probably not. But I think that what we're talking about here is a way in which you could get beyond the cynical nature of, I mean, our society is cynical. So when you're filled with people, you're not davening with people from the 4th century. So once you're filled with people who are contemporaries, it's a core aesthetic question that needs to be solved. And maybe with that, I'll invite you to come back next week. Thank you.